The records from the early 19th century are incomplete, faded, or intentionally erased. But in a collection of deteriorating county documents from western Tennessee, two names recur like stains that won't wash out: Elias and Ephraim Whaley. Twin boys, both confined to the now demolished New Providence House for the Incorrigible, a short-lived yet haunting facility built on the edge of Jackson County in 1819. What happened within its walls is subject to speculation, hushed local legend, and unofficial family lore passed through generations. But none of it explains why multiple census entries list the Whaley twins as alive and institutionalized across 3 decades, despite their official date of death being recorded as February 1823. New Providence House was never intended to be permanent. Hastily constructed in 1819 after an increase in juvenile incivilities along the Tennessee River Valley, it served as an experimental institution for boys judged too disruptive for workhouses, yet too young for formal imprisonment. The language used by officials was moralistic, a site of rehabilitation, a house for tempering wild character. Locals remember it differently. Even in its brief existence, it was whispered about, citing strange cries at night, mismatched headcounts, and staff who resigned suddenly without explanation. The property was razed in 1834, following a fire that spared only the administrative ledger. The names of the Whaley twins appear no fewer than 27 times in those pages, erratically and long after their recorded burial. This is not a ghost story. It's a record of 2 real children who may have lived and suffered through something Tennessee's early statehood chose to forget: the institution's reputation. New Providence House was commissioned in 1818 under Governor Joseph McMinn's administration, pitched as part of a broader campaign to civilize Tennessee's emerging counties. Built with county funds and supported by private donations from local Protestant congregations, it was situated on leased farmland 7 miles west of Gainsboro, on a knoll overlooking the Caudle Hollow. The site was chosen for its seclusion. Publicly, this was explained as necessary to protect the boys from negative influence. Privately, it was said that the site was isolated enough that no one could hear a boy crying for help. The first superintendent was a former Methodist preacher named Caleb R. Holt, known for his strict readings of Levitical punishment and a firm belief in discipline through silence. His application letter still exists in a state archive, where he writes, "These children are not blank slates but marked ones, scarred with sin. It is not kindness they need, but structure." The early mission of New Providence was spiritual correction as much as behavioral reform. The boys admitted were often from families too poor to contest court orders, or whose guardians had died during the fever seasons of 1816 to 1819. In these years of instability, vagrancy laws swept many children into the institution under vaguely defined charges like chronic mischief, refusal to conform, and incapacity for labor. At its peak in 1822, New Providence housed 48 boys between the ages of 6 and 14. The facility had no formal medical staff, only Reverend Holt, 2 assistants, one of whom was a failed seminary student named Silas Deming, and a rotating crew of minders recruited from surrounding farms, often paid in livestock feed or tobacco vouchers. There was no charter outlining educational standards, no inspections recorded, and no accountability framework from the Jackson County court system. Despite this, New Providence received public praise. The Jackson County Courier, a weekly sheet printed in Carthage, called it a light in the darkness of juvenile ungodliness. By 1821, church newsletters from Nashville were referring to it as a model of God-fearing order. What these endorsements failed to mention was that the boys were held in cramped rooms with wooden pegs for beds, given minimal rations, and expected to perform field labor for up to 11 hours a day. The windows were sealed with iron lattice. There was no heating source during the winter months. Punishment logs kept by Silas Deming contain entries marked with only initials and vague descriptors like refused to kneel, separated for 3 days, or laughter during evening hymn, diet withheld. The first documented mention of the Whaley twins appears in a brief intake ledger dated October 3, 1821. Their entry reads, Elias and Ephraim W., presumed age 10, delivered by Mr. Horace L. per community petition. Described as uncooperative, indistinct in speech, and disturbing to household order. No parental names are listed. No origin town is cited. Mr. Horace L. has no other appearances in county documents. They arrived with no documentation, no birth record, no church baptismal note, no property attachment. Just two boys, seemingly without past. Within 3 months, their names dominate the punishment logs. Dec 18, Ephraim W. Disrupted morning prayer. Stared without blinking. Removed from room. Jan 3, Elias W. mimicked hymn melody backward. Isolated. Jan 20, both twins returned to restricted quarters. Episodes, staff uneasy. None of these descriptions identify specific behavioral violations. There is no medical explanation recorded. But in the margins, written in Reverend Holt's unmistakable script, a curious note appears repeatedly. They are not to be left alone together. Despite the increasing severity of their punishments, no expulsion or transfer was ever attempted. While other boys were released after serving sentences of 6 months to a year, Elias and Ephraim remained. From 1821 to 1823, they were never removed from the rolls. Yet the death register, dated February 11, 1823, includes both their names, listing them as deceased from inward fever, a term commonly used at the time for undiagnosed illness. No burial location is cited, but their presence doesn't end there. Starting in May 1823, the names E. Whaley and E. Whaley reappear in shift rosters, marked as present. In late 1824, a visiting circuit minister records in his journal, 2 boys in upper hall, both unresponsive but calm, said to be of the Whaley pair. He was unaware of their supposed death date. In a follow-up entry a year later, the same minister notes, still housed. Staff instructed me not to question. There is a general nervousness about them. Former employees interviewed decades later spoke of the twins in vague, fearful terms. One, a woman named Charity Pike, who worked in the laundry for 2 summers, recalled in 1871, I saw them once, only once. They never moved their mouths. But they watched, always watched, and no one ever cleaned their room but Mr. Deming. When the fire consumed most of New Providence in 1834, no official investigation was conducted. Reverend Holt had died 2 years earlier. Deming had left the state. But in the preserved ledger, scorched along its binding, the Whaley names appear for the last time in the entry for April 1833. Relocated to Eastern Wing, no change. Daily observations, no further entries required. The institution had operated just 15 years. It was never rebuilt. Official histories refer to it as an early moral facility, notable only for its short lifespan, but in local oral traditions, the place still carries weight. In Gainsborough, older families still avoid walking the eastern hill past dusk. In Cordell Hollow, hunters report dogs refusing to pass certain thickets near the foundation stones that remain. And at the county archive, a single page remains in a locked file drawer, a list of 20 names, all boys, all marked with a circle beside their initials. Only 2 names are circled twice. Ignored signs. By the time New Providence House burned to the ground in the spring of 1834, the local mood had shifted. Jackson County was entering a period of quiet expansion. New churches were being built. The river economy was stabilizing. And while the public face of New Providence had faded from prominence, small references continued to surface in private writings, death certificates, and the administrative ephemera of surrounding counties. Together they painted a disturbing portrait of negligence, cover-up, and deliberate omission, particularly where the Whaley twins were concerned. In 1825, 2 years after Elias and Ephraim were supposedly buried, a physician's apprentice named Owen R. Tillman submitted a letter to the Tennessee State Medical Committee. He had traveled to New Providence to assist with a planned vaccination drive aimed at stemming the region's recent outbreaks of typhoid and summer grippe. His letter, filed under Miscellaneous Observations, contains an unusual passage. 2 boys were brought to me, twin in appearance, unnaturally pale. Their skin did not respond to pressure and neither produced speech. When prompted to open their mouths for inspection, they resisted in perfect synchrony. The minder warned me not to provoke them. I was told their prior death was administrative only due to a clerical mishap. But even then, I was left disturbed. This document remained unread in an archive box until its rediscovery in 1976 by a university historian researching early state medical practices. The note was never followed up on. The minders mentioned were unnamed. No additional vaccinations were ever logged for the boys, suggesting that the visit had been aborted. The idea of administrative deaths was not uncommon in early Tennessee reform institutions. With few centralized oversight mechanisms, many facilities simply struck names from their rosters to avoid further legal or financial obligations. Death in these cases was often paperwork, a tool for cleansing burdensome entries. But in the Whaley case, this erasure was partial. The twins continued to be fed, housed, and monitored. A separate journal entry from 1826, written by a maintenance worker named Wesley Norland, reflects confusion. "I was made to patch the window panes in the upper west room again. The boys broke them." But when I asked which boys, the supervisor only said, "You know the ones that don't belong on the rolls." As the years progressed, the discrepancies mounted. In 1827, a census taker named Lucius Branfield made a note in his county enumeration records that caught the attention of future investigators. Institution at Providence counted 38 male youth. Supervisor claimed 40. I was shown a locked room, heard rustling, low murmuring. Not permitted to enter, the supervisor appeared nervous. Census records from that year list only 38 residents, and then there were the resignations. Between 1824 and 1830, 10 staff members left New Providence under ambiguous circumstances. Most cited family illness or seasonal farm obligations, but internal notes reveal deeper concerns. One letter left unsigned but found among Reverend Holt's preserved correspondence reads, "The two who share a bed must be removed. They do not eat unless together. They do not speak unless it is to each other. When separated, they howl. Not with sound, but with pressure. The boys say they feel it in their teeth." The writer goes on to suggest relocating them to a sanatorium in Nashville. There is no evidence this was attempted. By that time, the presence of the Whaley twins had become a quiet threat within the institution, not for what they did, but for what they represented. A persistent reminder of administrative failure and a source of growing unease that no one wanted to document explicitly. An especially telling document emerged in 1854, 20 years after the fire. It was part of a posthumous estate filing by the family of Silas Deeming, the assistant who had lived at New Providence for over a decade. Among his personal effects was a notebook labeled Observations E&E. Its contents, written over a span of 5 years, are fragmented and heavily redacted, with entire pages torn out. But what remains suggests a routine surveillance that grew increasingly obsessive. March 2, they stand without prompting when the bell sounds, yet no bell rang today. June 8th, they have begun waking at identical times, even when placed in separate quarters. September 12th, attempted to administer separate tasks, both refused. Returned to corner, refused eye contact. January 17th, dreamt of one. Awoke to the other sitting at the foot of my bed. I had locked my door. No physical evidence was ever found tying the boys to harm. No official reprimands appear in the county court logs. Yet the volume of personal testimony reveals a pattern of discomfort among nearly every adult who came into contact with them. In 1829, Charity Pike, the laundry assistant whose testimony would be recorded later in life, reported something to the circuit judge of Jackson County. Though the letter is no longer available, a court filing from that year references a civil complaint of unnatural observation practices by male staff. No charges were filed. Instead, the court ordered a review of operations, which was conducted by a local deacon and 2 town elders. Their report, written in a single page of florid praise, concluded, "The Providence House appears a moral and orderly institution. The complaints, if any, stem from the weaknesses of those who lack the stomach for proper correction. It's worth noting that this report was signed only by the deacon. One of the town elders, a man named Elijah Rood, died less than 2 weeks later in what was described as a self-inflicted wound. His family contested this description, claiming he had returned from the visit to New Providence agitated beyond comprehension. Following the fire in 1834, surviving documentation was scattered. Local townspeople salvaged some items, and a handful of ledgers made their way into private collections. It wasn't until the early 20th century that local historian Clara M. Birch began compiling oral histories from the region. Her transcriptions held at the Tennessee State Library contain at least 9 accounts mentioning the silent twins or the boys upstairs. Most accounts come from former staff descendants who spoke in hushed tones about strange orders, forbidden wings, and the unshakable feeling that some children had not been sent there to be rehabilitated, but to be hidden. One of the final mentions appears in the 1911 memoir of Dr. Henry Lampert, a traveling physician who claimed to have visited the ruins of New Providence as a boy in the 1850s. He writes, "There were scorch marks on the stone walls, no roof, just open sky and the bones of the building. But I remember the staircase, half standing, blackened. At its base, my uncle paused. He told me, 'This is where they kept the ones who didn't age.' I didn't know what that meant, but it made my chest tighten." If true, Lampert's story aligns with earlier records indicating that the Whaley twins, born approximately in 1811, would have been over 20 by the time the building was destroyed. Yet no documentation exists for their transfer. No graves have ever been found. And while most of New Providence's wards eventually re-entered society, often under changed names or through indentured farm placements, the twins left no such trail. To this day, no official investigation has ever been launched into their case. Horror uncovered. By the 1960s, historical societies in Tennessee had begun to take a more active role in preserving local records, especially those tied to early statehood institutions. The Jackson County Heritage Committee, under the direction of Mildred Swafford, initiated a preservation effort in 1962 that led to the rediscovery of several burned or misfiled boxes in the county records vault. Among them were 3 partially intact administrative logs from New Providence House, long thought destroyed in the 1834 fire. These documents would become central to a suppressed 1967 investigation conducted quietly by the University of Tennessee's Department of Social Work. The investigation was never publicly announced. Internally, it was referred to as Project Cardinal, and its purpose was to examine early child reform institutions to better understand the origins of institutional mistreatment practices. New Providence was selected due to the volume of recovered material and the odd consistencies in personal testimonies, particularly those surrounding the Whaley twins. What the researchers found contradicted the state's public history of the institution. First, there were the inconsistencies in food records. Multiple quarters between 1824 and 1833 showed rations exceeding the recorded population. One entry from June 1828 logged 44 boys in residence, but food allocations for 46. These disparities occurred almost exclusively in weeks where no new intakes or departures were logged. Marginal notes, likely added by the assistant Silas Deming, vaguely referred to EW and EW. Under supplemental nutrition, non-reported. The term non-reported appears nowhere else in the ledgers. Second were the maps. In 1965, state archivists commissioned a ground scan of the former Providence site using early geophysical equipment. What they uncovered surprised them. A sealed substructure beneath the foundation, not included in any official blueprints. Measuring 14 by 18 feet, with a narrow corridor leading toward the western end of the building, it appeared to be an undocumented room. Initial attempts to excavate were blocked by the landowner at the time, who claimed ancestral rights over the burial land and forbade further disturbance. However, ground-penetrating radar suggested that the space had contained 2 vertical metal structures resembling restraint frames. Later assessments confirmed the presence of degraded biological evidence in the soil consistent with human occupancy over extended periods. None of this was made public. One member of the research team, Dr. Phyllis Rowe, later spoke to an independent journalist under condition of anonymity. Her notes, preserved posthumously by her nephew, contain this chilling entry dated August 18, 1966. The room was real. It was intentional. The frames were child-sized. Whoever used them did so regularly. The Whaley records aren't metaphor. They were kept down there, monitored, tracked without ever being included. The other boys may not have even known they existed. But it wasn't just physical evidence that began to paint a disturbing picture. Project Cardinal uncovered a series of correspondences between Reverend Caleb Holt and a Nashville-based donor known only as R.H. Garvin. These letters, preserved in an unrelated collection of church materials, suggest a parallel funding stream intended for private study of identical subjects under duress. In one letter, Holt writes, "The specimens remain stubborn in all but one respect, synchronicity. Their habits to mirror each other with mechanical precision. I will redouble efforts to disaggregate their will." The language is clinical, detached. Nowhere are the boys named, but the context is clear. A memo from Garvin, dated March 1826, expresses concern over the degenerative outcome of continuous exposure and recommends pulsed periods of complete sensory reduction. There is no further correspondence past 1827. In 1967, the University of Tennessee quietly concluded Project Cardinal without publishing its findings. A private memo from the department chair to the office of the Chancellor reads, "The material uncovered at Providence is more ethically fraught than we anticipated. Given the speculative nature of much of it and the impossibility of follow-up, I recommend shelving all further work in this direction." The files were sealed, yet the story continued to leak into local consciousness in subtle, haunting ways. In 1974, a regional folklorist named Leonard Combs published a volume of Appalachian oral histories in which he included a peculiar account from an elderly woman in Gainsborough. She claimed her great-grandmother had worked at Providence during its final year, and that she'd once been instructed to deliver bread to the Mirror Boys, who lived in the dry place where sunlight don't go. The detail that most disturbed Combs was the woman's assertion that the boys were always cold to the touch, even in summer, even when you held them. In 1983, a maintenance worker renovating the Jackson County Courthouse uncovered an iron strongbox tucked behind a false wall in the old records room. Inside were 6 pages of what appeared to be personal notes by Silas Deming, never formally filed. Most were indecipherable, written in code or damaged by moisture, but one line stood out, scrawled clearly in ink near the top of a partially intact page. "They don't eat unless together. They don't sleep unless watched. They don't age." This line, dismissed by county officials as metaphorical or fictional, was later verified by forensic historians who analyzed the ink and paper and confirmed its origin from the 1830s. The line reappeared again in a 1997 book, self-published by a former UT student, who had gained brief access to the Cardinal materials before they were permanently resealed. The book, Brothers in Silence, sold only a few dozen copies before being pulled due to an injunction from the university, citing unauthorized use of archival material. It remains nearly impossible to build a linear narrative around Elias and Ephraim Whaley. Too many contradictions, too many disappearances, of people, papers, proof. But what remains unmistakable is the weight of institutional silence that wrapped itself around their story. Every formal attempt to examine the case met with resistance, redirection, or quiet abandonment. Every testimony that approached truth was labeled as folklore, misremembered history, or psychological projection. But among the dozens of records, testimonies, and surviving notes, one question repeats like a refrain. If they died in 1823, why were they seen in 1826? If they were buried, why was no grave ever marked? And if they never left, why can some still hear footsteps beneath the old stone hill? Legacy and silence. By the turn of the 21st century, the story of New Providence House and the Whaley twins had become a historical cul-de-sac, known to a few, discussed by fewer, and rarely accepted without skepticism. Yet certain local families, descendants of staff, nearby landowners, or boys who had once been confined there, maintained guarded recollections that refused to fade. These were not tales told for entertainment. They were warnings, shared in hushed tones and seldom repeated in daylight. In 2001, a privately funded archaeological team from a Nashville college, posing as a land survey group, returned to the original site of New Providence. Their goal was simple: document foundation remnants before a new developer repurposed the area for residential expansion. The survey took only 2 days. On the third, they left abruptly. No report was ever submitted. One team member, interviewed anonymously in 2006, recalled that the group had discovered a shallow corridor beneath what was once the East Wing. He described what appeared to be iron mounts still embedded in the floor and deep scratches on the underside of the remaining beams. No artifacts were taken. He claimed a silent agreement was made to leave everything undisturbed. Jackson County eventually approved the development plans. But the housing project stalled indefinitely after multiple construction crews refused to work on the eastern parcels, citing faulty equipment and worker injuries. Officially, the site was declared geologically unstable. Unofficially, the rumors persisted. Tools that vanished, sounds of breathing in cleared lots, and 2 contractors who suffered seizures on separate occasions within yards of where the undocumented substructure had once been. Plotted. By 2010, the case had attracted a small cult following online. Amateur investigators began trading scans of the Deming Ledger and copies of the 1911 Lampert memoir. Forums circulated theories ranging from twin psychology experiments to early behavioral conditioning trials. But even within these circles, serious researchers hit a wall. Every time one attempted to access the full Project Cardinal files, they were either denied or redirected to redacted summaries. FOIA requests went unanswered. And those who pressed further began to receive quiet visits, unofficial university representatives, reminding them that the project was terminated and that any remaining material was property of the university, not subject to public release. But silence has a way of preserving detail, just out of reach. In 2014, a woman named Althea Norton, a retired psychiatric nurse, published a memoir detailing her 30 years of experience in mental health facilities across the South. Buried in the 3rd chapter was a paragraph that stunned those who had followed the Whaley case. Norton recounted her time at a now-defunct center in Knoxville during the 1970s. There, she claimed, 2 male patients were transferred in from a discontinued rural facility with no prior files and no confirmed guardianship. The patients, she wrote, were described by staff as linked. They refused to eat unless placed in the same room, showed marked physical symmetry, and were listed in all files with identical initials, EW. She was told not to ask questions. The descriptions match no known patients in public records from that decade, and while the boys' files were supposedly destroyed in a 1981 facility closure, Norton insisted the twins, who appeared in their early 20s, spoke little, aged slowly, and were periodically subjected to tests conducted not by hospital doctors, but by visiting university staff. Whether this account reflects reality or trauma-distorted memory remains contested. But it echoes earlier records from New Providence too closely to dismiss, and it fits the pattern. 2 boys, same initials, unaging, silent, always watched but never officially acknowledged. By 2020, much of the physical legacy of New Providence House had been erased. The site had become a patch of unpaved development land, used intermittently for storage and utility work. The remaining stone markers were removed and discarded. No plaque, no marker, no official history remains on site. And yet the records persist. In the Jackson County Courthouse, 2 signatures remain preserved in a crumbling ledger, both dated 1832, both written in the same hand, but with differing pressure. E. Whaley, E. Whaley. In a broader sense, their story survives not because of documentation, but because of the persistent failures surrounding them. The falsified death records, the inexplicable reappearances, the institutional refusals to clarify, and the private notes that painted a picture no one wanted to endorse. Their existence, whatever it was represents a chilling convergence of early reformist zeal, bureaucratic indifference, and a system designed to isolate difficult children rather than understand them. When asked in a 1988 interview why no formal memorial had ever been proposed for the boys who died or vanished, at New Providence, a county historian replied, "There were no names, just numbers. And most folks don't like remembering what the numbers used to mean. But numbers do not forget. Names echo even when erased. And sometimes, on overcast days, local children still dare each other to climb the eastern ridge and listen. They say if you kneel at the stone where the old corridor once began and press your ear to the ground, you'll hear something. Not a voice, not a sound exactly, but the sensation of pressure behind your teeth." Just like they said at Providence, if this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.